Hello? Hello? Testing, testing. Still testing the mic. Haven't started the live stream yet. Or started the live stream? Okay. All right. Hello, and thank you for being here at the Julian Assange's Free celebration of the movement. Still figuring out the mic here. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, everybody? Great. All right. Okay, Julian Assange is finally free after 5 years. Finally free after 5 years of abusive conditions in a maximum security prison, after a dozen years of arbitrary detention of one kind or another. Assange's crime, of course, was practicing an investigative journalism that was too thorough, too expository, too effective. In a small courtroom in the Northern Mariana Islands in late June, Julian signed a plea deal, which importantly is not the same type of precedent as a conviction, under the Espionage Act for conspiracy to obtain classified information, which importantly is not for publishing that information. Meaning that while the US is surely happy to have obtained something under the Espionage Act, we have successfully not only freed Julian, we have prevented the full-scale criminalization of journalism that the United States wanted. So thanks to all of our work, as well as the tireless work of an incredible international legal team, Julian is a free man today. I know that so many of you who have been following Julian's case have been hoping to hear from Julian himself, and I hope we hear from him too. But I know from speaking with Stella continually, and briefly with him personally, that they are really enjoying freedom right now. They are enjoying nature and wildlife and their children and the analog world. I'm sure that we will hear from him when he's ready, and that he'll have plenty to say. But this is an opportunity to tell our story. Julian is free, and this is no small feat. The US threatened 175 years over Julian's head. It took us 5 to finally secure his release, and this is a victory for Julian, for press freedom, but it's also a victory for international activism. This is why Assange Defense is hosting these events. There have been other events, and I want to shout them out. Deepa Driver in the UK organized a really beautiful global event on Zoom featuring dozens of the major activists who've been a part of this around the world. But we are the support network here in the United States, and we are gathered here in New York. Tomorrow, our Bay Area branch is hosting a similar celebration in Berkeley, and next week, our DC branch is doing the same down at Busboys and Poets. Those will also be recorded, by the way, and we'll have great speakers at both. Alice Walker, I believe, is going to be in Berkeley. Julian's brother, Gabriel Shipton, is going to be in Washington, D.C. And so we are here to celebrate not only Julian Assange and what his freedom means for journalists everywhere. We are here also to tell the story of the thousands of activists around the world who worked in concert to help make that happen. So I want to read an expanded version of the piece that I wrote when Julian was freed earlier this summer. I think it's my best summation of how we got here. It's entitled, "A Global Movement Freed Assange." The movement to free Julian Assange has been a truly global effort. Activists on nearly every continent, in dozens of countries and hundreds of cities, have each played a meaningful part in securing Julian's release. I'm so happy for Julian finally getting the freedom he's deserved for so long. And I'm so proud and honored to have been a part of that effort, to have met so many amazing people along the way. While a plea deal was signed at the culmination of this saga, what happened outside of the courtroom has been just as important as inside. Knowing that an extremely protracted process can be punishment, that justice delayed is denied, and that this case has always been political as well as legal, we've always tried to influence both our fellow citizens and our elected officials just as much as any judge. Activists had carried out just about every action we could think of as we tried to spread the word and communicate the importance of this case. We rallied in the streets, hosted panel discussions, called our representatives, wrote op-eds, shared blog posts, produced videos, created artworks. If there's a method to communicate, you can bet an Assange activist used it to shout loud and clear, "Free Assange." This effort required incredible teamwork and voices in every corner of civil society speaking up. There are now fully organized groups of lawyers, professors, artists, politicians, doctors, journalists, and free press and human rights groups, which have all co-authored letters to the United States and United Kingdom governments to call for Julian's freedom. Assange Defense is a project of the organization I direct, the Courage Foundation, which had already been underway for half a decade when Assange was arrested in April of 2019, having worked previously to defend and support Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Lowry Love, and others. And we'd already been covering the abuses and persecution Julian faced while in the Ecuadorian embassy in London before that. But once he was arrested, I started meeting regularly with like-minded activists in the United States. And I want to shout out specifically the people I met with on a regular basis for those first couple of years. Our group included Vinny DiStefano, who became our national organizer, who's speaking later on today. Margaret Kunstler, the legendary civil rights lawyer, who's speaking here as well today. The late, great Marty Goodman. A bunch of lawyers, Jim Lafferty, Stephen Rohde, Deborah Herbeck, Marjorie Cohn, and activists like Chuck Zlatkin, Bernadette Evangelist, Michael Smith, Ann Battiza, Paula Iacella, Susan McLucas, Patricia Dahl, Dick and Sharon Kyle, Jeff Mackler, Mike Madden, Frank Lawrence, Eric Harvey, Suzanne Murphy, Kendra Christian, Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, Joe Lombardo, and over the years, several more came in and out of our regular meetings, both on Zoom and in person. And soon Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's, who has graciously provided some free ice cream we'll be handing out later today. Ben stepped in to help us build up a real campaign team. He connected me with the PR team, copywriters, social media managers, artists. He helped make us legit. This has been an enormous help, and yet it is the energy of volunteers that has been the true engine of this movement. I've always been proud of our reach, especially with limited funds and so many volunteers, and the fact that we quickly created branches in cities all across the country, starting here in New York and Los Angeles, Denver, Milwaukee, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. By tabling for Assange at Roger Waters' U.S. tour, as well as screenings of the documentary Ithaca with Julian's brother and father, we were able to expand even further, building that network out with supporters in just about every major city in the United States. We've organized and carried out dozens of campaigns within the larger goal of freeing Assange. We've co-hosted a webinar series with Stella Assange. We've lobbied Congress with letters and emails and phone calls and postcards. We've gotten supporters to write letters to their editors and newspapers all across the country. We've created pamphlets and flyers and posters and collages and montages. Activist groups in New York City and London were in the streets every week for years, sounding the alarm and never giving up. Now, Assange Defense has either been a part of or uplifted many of these efforts, but we are far from the only ones. There are so many groups and activists who have been dedicated to this fight, including Free Assange in the UK, the Australian Assange Campaign, support groups across Europe and Latin America, and individuals across the United States undertaking solo efforts to get the word out. It's amazing how wide-reaching this movement is and how many people have gotten involved. Exactly how many supporters we have around the world is just impossible to measure. We've seen petitions with hundreds of thousands of signatures, live streams with quarters of millions total views, and we've been able to sell out movie theaters and fill lecture halls at various events. At Courage, before Assange's arrest, we launched a photo campaign in support of Julian called We Are Millions, and it really does feel like it took the global village to free him. I'm really proud to have been one leader among many within that movement and to see our indefatigable, passionate work finally pay off. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to stay up here and introduce the other speakers. I'm also going to read here a short statement from attorney Michael Smith, who worked closely with Michael Ratner, after whom this room is named. We stopped them from killing Julian Assange, statement by Michael Stephen Smith. Michael Ratner was the president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He was Julian's first lawyer. He worked on the case till the day he died. Michael and I were doing our radio show, Law and Disorder, together. Julian used to call over to Michael's office frequently on a secure line when we were there recording the radio show. Michael and Len Weinglass, the great movement criminal defense lawyer, flew over to London to meet with Julian. They explained to him that his life and freedom were in jeopardy, that he could not go to Sweden where he was wanted on fake sex offense charges because the Swedes would quickly turn him over to the US government, where he'd be tried in a hostile court and sent away to a maximum security prison, a communications management unit where he'd be entombed for life. Julian received political asylum granted by the brave Ecuadorian government. He ended up in 2 tiny rooms in their small building in London. The USA tried to drive him to suicide, and they came close. Then CIA Director Mike Pompeo plotted to assassinate him. They made plans, and the scandalous story came out. All the while, a movement sprung up and grew in many countries around the world. The core activists here in New York who built this movement are here in this room. We met for the first time before COVID in the offices of OR Books, under the direction of Colin Robinson. OR published a number of key books by and in defense of Julian, including the book edited by Margaret Kimberley and Tariq Ali. I want to recognize Chuck Zlatkin, Bernadette Evangelist, Patricia Dahl, and the late Marty Goodman. It is not being melodramatic to say that we saved his life, the life of the greatest journalist of our times. Thank you. You have all my love and solidarity. Michael Stephen Smith. So next up, we have one of the 2 great co-organizers and leaders of this event, Chuck Zlatkin.
Okay, thank you. I'm Chuck Zlatkin from NYC Free Assange, and it's important for us to get together to celebrate our victories. I remember a big celebration that took place in Central Park, May 11th, 1975, for the end of the Vietnam War. And now we have today another victory for the grassroots. Our involvement started in May of 2019, participating in an International Day of Action to free Julian Assange with other New Yorkers. But we realized that it wasn't enough, so we decided to meet every Thursday for a vigil in front of the British consulate to free Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. In June of 2019, we moved to the New York Times building to bring focus on the Times for the role it played in demonizing Assange and the fact that they, as journalists and publishers, were not standing for his defense. In August, we decided that we needed to have a name, so we called ourselves NYC Free Assange. Our next move was inside Grand Central Terminal in front of the big clock until we needed to cease because of COVID. NYC Free Assange played an active role in many events over the years, from the prosecution of Julian Assange, his right to publish is our right to know, held at the CUNY Law School, organized by the Courage Foundation, the Global Day of Protest in New York City, Don't Extradite Assange, featuring Margaret Kimberley, Michael Stephen Smith, and Ben Norton, right up until the protest to defend the free press, Day X, this year also at the UK consulate. In celebrating activists in New York, a special mention must go to Randy Credico. With his 6 years of weekly Assange Countdown to Freedom programs on radio station WBAI, his stand-ups for Assange, and many hours on the mobile Assange billboard trucks. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge with a special call out to some of the original NYC Free Assanges who were out there in the streets in the freezing cold and the sweltering heat for Assange. Sati, Leslie, Patricia, Jim, Zool, Bernadette, Roberto, Julie, Priscilla, Marty, Alan, Sam, the brothers from NYC Veterans for Peace, and me, Chuck. and many more. I'm sure I'll see you all active in the streets fighting for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Now we're going to hear from Margaret Kimberley, civil rights attorney and founding member of the Assange Defense Committee.
I haven't really prepared anything, but here I am, and I never expected to be here. I really, in the beginning, I had hopes, but as things got worse and worse, I really felt that we were stuck. And the reason we got unstuck is because of the people here and the people all around the United States who got together and refused to give up no matter what was happening. And that, to me, was kind of the rebirth of an international movement that had been dormant for quite a while. It's come back to life now in many ways, and in many ways, when a movement comes back to life, we're in the same situation because we have more and more repression as a result of it. We're engaged in 2 wars. We have tremendous amount of silencing of not only of the press, but any people who come out in favor of an unpopular side lose their jobs, are forced to either recapitulate or they'll be fired. I mean, it's really been in the last period a very hard time to live in the United States. And I know that all of you people who have worked so hard for Assange are going to continue the effort to see if we could get rid of the censorship that is really stifling this movement. People just don't know, and that was the problem with Assange as well. People didn't know what was happening, and they didn't know what was happening because our press is so bad, because they're so controlled by the corporations. Julian had a comment on that. He said that censorship got much worse when the government and the corporations got together. And that's really where we're at today. The government and the corporations are working hand in hand, and silencing from both inside the workers' movement and outside with people who are demonstrating, who are really, if they say the wrong thing, they could lose their job, they can be threatened by the FBI. I mean, it's a very difficult time that we're living in, and we need to, again, work with the National Lawyers Guild and the Mass Defense Committee, who are really there still working to free people who get arrested. And that's a critical job, because if you stay in the jail, you're not on the streets. And that's what they want. I want to mention that that there are many other people who benefited directly from this situation with Assange being, the charges being dropped. And I think that we're not going to know who they are, probably, but let me tell you that I visited some right after the indictment was dismissed, and there are many people who are very relieved and who feel like they have their lives back together again, too, and that they can now move around and do the things that they wanted to do, that they were prevented from doing because they were under such strict observation. I guess that's all I want to say, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for all the work you've been doing. I just want to mention that the United States is really Assange Central now. It's Assange Central because of the pardon that's being sought, and because the last legal action is in the Southern District of New York, which is Kunstler against the CIA. Yeah. So you know, it isn't easy to fight the CIA, and there are a lot of protections and secrecy rules that prevent these trials from going ahead. It's very much like what happened during the Central America movement and other movements, because they come up with an excuse why people have no authority in the courtrooms. So they took away the right of people to challenge wars. And that took away a great opportunity to organize people, because if your courtroom turned out to be a very good place to organize people. But everything was considered a political question, and therefore no cases could go to trial. And here we have the state secret document that is going to be raised in every case that anybody raises in terms of questioning the control of the national security press and other aspects of life in the United States, because they can't, because the CIA refuses to even acknowledge whether an investigation was carried out. And we know, we clearly know that Assange was under investigation at the embassy, and that anybody who visited him was also under investigation. So once again, we have a difficult uphill fight, and I'm glad you're all here and still with us.
Thank you. Thank you. As Margaret mentions, there are a couple aspects of Assange's case that are kind of still going or unfinished business, and one of those is the effort to sue the CIA for violations of privacy of those who visited Assange in the embassy. Another one of those is that Defending Rights and Dissent is suing the FBI for failing to provide documentation in response to its FOIA requests, so we might learn a whole lot more from the result of that lawsuit. And of course, people are continuing to fight for a pardon. So while this is an incredible victory, the fight certainly continues. So next we're going to hear from editor of the Black Agenda Report, Margaret Kimberley.
Good evening. Thank you all so much. As I always begin by, as my mentor, my late mentor, Glenn Ford, taught me, by saying, power to the people. Yes! Power to the people. All right, great. And yes, I'm Margaret Kimberley of Black Agenda Report, and I've been a proud supporter of Julian Assange for many years. And I'll start off with a brief recap of his saga and connect it with current events and issues that are impacting us. First, I want to say it's a pleasure to finally be speaking about Julian Assange as a captive in the past tense. This is my first time publicly speaking of him as a free man. In June, the sudden announcement that Assange would be freed was a welcome surprise, freed after a plea agreement. Assange and the WikiLeaks team were targets of U.S. Persecution and prosecution by 3 different presidential administrations because they revealed secrets the state doesn't want us to know. WikiLeaks revealed war crimes committed by the George W. Bush administration in their Iraq war logs and Afghanistan war logs. And Private Chelsea Manning leaked the collateral murder video, which shows the deaths of civilians, including 2 reporters, Reuters reporters, as they were gunned down by a U.S. Army helicopter crew in 2007. Collateral Murder was released in 2010 when Barack Obama was president. All of the supposed differences between Republicans and Democrats disappear when U.S. hegemony is in need of protection. Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder confirmed that Assange was under investigation, and while the Justice Department ultimately chose not to indict, they laid the groundwork for Donald Trump to make Assange a political prisoner. Obama's unprecedented use of the Espionage Act sent other whistleblowers to jail and gave Trump license to get his hands on Assange. The Trump administration built on the work of the Obama DOJ and secured a 17-count indictment in 2018 with charges that could have resulted in a 175-year sentence. Of course, criminal charges were useless as long as the Ecuadorian government gave Assange sanctuary in its London embassy. The Trump administration interfered in Ecuador's election and brought a different political party to office and then secured a $4 billion IMF loan for Ecuador, just 1 month before Assange's protections were lifted. And the timing of that is hardly coincidental. Even after Assange was indicted and then removed from the Ecuadorian embassy, the Trump administration had harsher measures in mind. CIA Director Mike Pompeo declared WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service, and sources have reported on plans to kidnap or even to assassinate Assange. As always, Joe Biden followed Trump foreign policy and continued the DOJ prosecution. In April, Biden revealed he was considering a plea agreement for Assange. What he did not say was that Assange's case was not going in the direction that the U.S. wanted. Assange's great legal team never gave up fighting for him, and the possibility that the British High Court of Justice would hear his claim of acting within the U.S. First Amendment guarantees of the right to speak moved the Biden administration to offer a plea deal rather than risk losing in court. It's wonderful news that Assange has his freedom, but it's come with a price for all of journalism. He had to plead guilty to one charge of violating the Espionage Act, and thus journalism can still be criminalized in the United States. What was his crime? He dared to tell the world what powerful people and states do not want us to know. And that was reason enough to be an Assange supporter. So many things said about him were untrue, that anyone was harmed by his revelations, that he worked with Russia or any foreign governments to obtain the Democratic National Committee emails. In fact, there's ample evidence the emails were leaked to him by someone at the DNC. So here we are again in an election year, and frankly, I don't recall a bleaker outlook in regard to our ability to seek information and to be free from state repression. The degree of collusion between corporate media and the state has never been stronger. And in this election year, the governing party markets itself as the Democratic, small d, wing of the duopoly while doing more to interfere with our right to speak freely and seek out information. Last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced new sanctions against the Russian-based network RT. I didn't think there was anything more they could do to RT after they already destroyed the RT American network and deplatformed it, and deprived us of our ability to seek out information. But suddenly, RT disappeared from all Meta platforms as well as YouTube, which had already been removed from Facebook and Instagram. The attack on RT was not very surprising, but the addition of the site African Stream as a target was. African Stream founder Ahmed Caballo is a respected journalist, and while a relatively new site, African Stream became a leader in journalism regarding the 54 African nations. But African Stream does not toe the U.S. line, as well it shouldn't, but Secretary Blinken claimed it was a Russian propaganda outlet. In just a few days, African Stream was also removed from Meta and has now been cut off from Stripe to receive donations. Fascism is here now and is most prevalent in the supposedly free collective West. In just a few weeks, Scott Ritter's home was raided by the FBI. Danny Shaw, already fired from his teaching position at City College, was questioned by the Border Patrol as he returned to the U.S. So was Dan Kovalik. In the UK, Richard Medhurst was arrested and held for nearly a day under a terrorism act which could send him to prison for allegedly supporting a proscribed organization. Here in New York City, college students and professors are told that Zionists are a protected class and that anything other than praise for them is a thought crime that can result in job loss, harassment, or expulsions from school. I mention all of these events because they're all connected to Assange's case. A journalist lost the rights his profession allegedly gave him. As the most well-documented genocide in history takes place, the media timidly tell us that we don't really see the IDF throwing people off of roofs. It appears they're throwing people off of roofs, or that there's something cool about the IDF sending a text to thousands of people in order to kill and maim them when they looked for a message in pagers that were packed with explosives. All of these things are tied to Assange's case. We see what happens when people are allowed to be marginalized and demonized, when journalists don't act as journalists should. The snowball effect of his persecution has led to the conditions I've described. It's clear we must continue the kinds of mobilizations that helped to free Julian Assange. I don't think we can exaggerate the depth of danger we face now on this planet, as independent media is under such extreme attack, and there are fewer and fewer outlets we can trust. I began by saying power to the people. That is all that can possibly save us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. We're lucky to have at least one and potentially two of the co-hosts of Useful Idiots here. First of all, we have Aaron Maté. I saw him earlier somewhere.
Hey there, great to be here. Can you hear me okay? Very happy to be here. As Margaret talked about before, this is a very grim time to be here on this planet. Certainly the grimmest of my lifetime. We're seeing, with full US support, Israel carry out a mass murder campaign in Gaza. As we're speaking today, it's continuing, accelerating its aggression in Lebanon, along with the routine aggression in the West Bank and Syria as well. We're really seeing right now the worst of humanity. So it's nice to be able to celebrate the best of humanity, which is Julian Assange and all the people who fought for his freedom. It's really rare in this wretched, unfair, cruel world to be able to celebrate some good news, but waking up to the news that Julian Assange was going to be free was that rare occasion, and we shouldn't take it lightly. Why does Julian Assange represent the best of humanity? Well, Julian Assange gave up his freedom and risked his life and was ready to lose his life for what? He's called a narcissist by his detractors in media. I think he's one of the most selfless people to ever live. He endured persecution, torture, smear campaigns, being separated from his family, his wife, his young children. For what goal? To educate the world about the crimes being committed in their name and behind their backs. And the people in power hate that. They hate the fact that he shed light on all their crimes, and not just the crimes that got the most attention. We all saw collateral murder. What a powerful moment that was to see on camera that massacre by US forces, showing the reality of the wars that the corporate stenographers were keeping from us. But it's not just that. He also exposed all the cynicism of our leaders, all the ways in which they tell us one thing in public and lie behind our backs. And like everybody has their own interests, their own causes, their own conflicts and issues that they focus on, and you can like spin the globe and land on any country, and Julian Assange will have, more likely than not, educated you in some profound way on some evil corruption and criminal activity there that most likely the US government was involved in. I can think of my personal favorites. I first got involved in in journalism by going to Haiti and seeing the aftermath of the 2004 coup, in which for the second time, the US and its allies conspired to overthrow Haiti's first democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And you can learn from the WikiLeaks cables that behind the scenes, US diplomats had this hatred of Aristide. And why? Because he had popular support. And one cable, I remember, lamented the fact that even after Aristide was overthrown and even after he was demonized in US-backed campaigns, still, Lavalas, his party, was still the most popular political force inside Haiti. And that just really angered these people. And of course, in public, we're not told that. We're told that we're there in Haiti to restore democracy, that Aristide's a dictator, all that stuff like that. We also learned about how the US government made sure to depress Haitian wages, because one of Aristide's major achievements in the brief years when he was allowed to be in power, because he was couped twice, once in the early 1990s, second time in 2004, was to help raise the minimum wage for average Haitians. And the US government conspired to actually cut that wage because the first free country in this hemisphere had to be put in its place. In Syria, we learned that well before the dirty war began in 2011, the US was conspiring to overthrow Bashar al-Assad and was seeking to exploit the fact that Assad was vulnerable to sectarian insurgents. And a cable from the mid-2000s talked about exploiting Assad's vulnerability, which of course the US and its allies did. And that's why in one of my most favorite emails from WikiLeaks, Jake Sullivan, our current national security advisor, wrote to Hillary Clinton that in the effort to overthrow the Syrian government, quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Hillary Clinton was also told that overthrowing the Syrian government would really help out Israel. This is from a State Department email to Hillary Clinton, the same year that Jake Sullivan said Al-Qaeda is on our side. The best way to help Israel deal with Iran's growing nuclear capability is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Now, actually, in real life, Iran did not have any nuclear capability. And the best way we learned was to deal with its potential capability was to have the Iran deal, which the Trump administration killed and Biden refused to restore. But this email goes on. It is the strategic relationship between Iran and the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria that makes it possible for Iran to undermine Israel's security. The end of the Assad regime would end this dangerous alliance. And what do they mean by undermining Israel's security? They meant resisting Israel's hegemony. And that's why right now we're seeing Israel carry out routine attacks still to this day in Syria and against its ally Hezbollah in Lebanon. So many, many more. WikiLeaks also, because of the bravery of Julian Assange, published the OPCW leaks, the most documented pro-war cover-up one of the most documented pro-war cover-ups in history. The OPCW censoring its own scientists who found no evidence to support the Trump administration's allegations that Syria committed a chemical attack in Douma. And all this is the result of Julian Assange's sacrifice. He had many opportunities to win his freedom, but he refused to back down, and he refused to stop his commitment to his mission, which is to tell people the truth and inform them with the facts. He famously said that if wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth. I'm someone who does not have the courage of Julian Assange, but certainly I love that credo of his, and I try to follow in that footsteps. If wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth. We're all here because we support peace, and that's why we're all celebrating the release of this person who has done more than arguably, I think, anybody else on this planet today to seek peace. And so, as horrible as this world is right now, let's take a moment to celebrate his freedom and celebrate the role of everybody here in bringing that about. And I want to honor, Chuck and everybody with the New York chapter of the Free Assange movement, who week after week went out there when everybody was moving on, not paying attention to Julian Assange's plight, who went out there to support him, to rally for his freedom, to keep his name on people's minds as corporate stenographers smeared him and tried to ignore him. It's really a people's victory in a planet that really needs some hope right now. So I'm happy to celebrate it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Is Katie here with us? I wasn't sure. She was hoping to make it a little late. If not, if she's here, let me know. She can jump up here at any time. But we'll go ahead and move on to Joe Loria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, back in my hometown after a very long time outside of it. I agree, obviously, with everything that Aaron and Margaret said. It's right to celebrate this victory, despite all the awful problems that have been elucidated here. There's a lot of work to be done. I'm reminded of this I.F. Stone quote. He said, the only kinds of fights worth fighting are those you're going to lose, because somebody has to fight them and lose and lose and lose until someday somebody who believes as you do wins. And I think that this sums up what everybody in this room and across the world did to try to get Julian Assange freed. But I'm going to qualify that in a moment, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the vicious enemy that he was up against, that in many ways we're all up against. The one facilitating a genocide in Gaza, the one that provoked an awful war in Ukraine and continuously tries to undermine any attempts to end. That only because of the luck of the Pentagon, the House of War, is what has given us peace right now, because they stopped this maniac, Tony Blinken, who an absolute neocon, who decided that in March 2022, he decided there was going to be a no-fly zone, and he announced it to CBS News from Moldova. We're going to have a no-fly zone. Of course, the Pentagon said, no way. And Biden went out there and said, that means World War III. We're not fighting World War III. So he was stopped. He kept his job miraculously. And now in the last week, we've seen how Blinken tried to get and leaked this to The Guardian. And it turns out, according to the Times of London, that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, believed Blinken when he said they were going to give him permission to use these long-range Storm Shadow missiles that have to be fired by British soldiers on the ground in Ukraine using U.S. geolocation technology. And that's Putin, of course, interpreted that as NATO directly involved in the war. And all bets were off then. And again, it was Lloyd Austin who stopped it. And Biden at the last minute, you know, on his good days, he kind of remembers that that he's only a traditional warmonger, not actually a neoconservative. He's just so, and he pulled back from the brink. But will that happen next time? So these are the lunatics running this country, and they want to run the whole world. That's the whole idea of the neocon agenda. If you read it in the Project for New American Century. They don't want any other power or alliance of powers to come anywhere on this globe that might stand in their megalomaniacal way to dominate the world, and they want to use American power for their own really petty interests and pretend. And they have to pretend to themselves that they're doing it to save democracy. Otherwise, they'd have to face the murderers that they are. These are the people that put Julian Assange in jail. Now, why was he released? Why was he released? I'm sure, show me anybody in this room, raise your hand, if you thought he was going to get out and he wouldn't have come here to the U.S. and die in an American dungeon. Some people did think that. I didn't. I thought he was going to come here to this country and die in a U.S. dungeon. Why didn't he? Why did that not happen? We have presidents, Obrador, Mexico. We had Lula. We had parliaments across Europe. We've had freedom of press organizations, human rights organizations. Even the mainstream media came out. The 5 mainstream media partners of WikiLeaks put out a statement saying you should be released. So there was enormous pressure on the White House, on the Department of Justice. I stood outside one day, Garland, what is his name? Yeah,
Merrick Garland.
Yeah, another Nixon, yeah. No, not Garland Nixon. No, yeah, Merrick Garland. He wasn't out there. No, Merrick Garland, sorry. Yeah, there was a group of people in Washington who went every Sunday to the front of the house of the. You were there? Oh, good. Department of Justice, the Attorney General. Sorry. And so these people have done enormous work, and we all should be proud of what we did. Alternative media clearly had a role. But in the end, we're talking about the most obstinate, stubborn, vicious people who didn't care and would have resisted the pressure, the most enormous pressure possible. So why did they let him go? Let's go to the Washington Post. Because they reported they got leaked an email. This is about a day after Julian was released. They got leaked an email from a Justice Department official in London working with the British lawyers that they had there, Claire Dobbin and James Lewis. And this email back to the Department of Justice said, the urgency here has now reached a critical point. The case will head to appeal, and we will lose. I'm sorry to say, despite all of our great efforts, that's why he was released. Because they were going to lose. I think it's as simple as that. You could have had 1 billion people marching for Julian Assange. How many people were out in the streets in London, in New York, in Paris, all over the world, Sydney, to stop the invasion of Iraq? Did that work? And I'm not suggesting don't get out into the street and do it. I'm not saying that the pressure didn't get to them, but they were resisting it to the very end until it became clear they were going to lose, and they admitted it in their own words in this Washington Post piece that has the leaked email. Funny enough, a leak. So I just think that while we should all be proud of what we did, and we're obviously grateful he's free, we have to understand what we're up against. As Margaret said, as Aaron said, and these fights just beginning against these people. But they have to know that they're going to lose. That's our job. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That reminds me, one of the projects Courage took on after Julian's freedom was to organize Western journalists in solidarity with the attacked and assaulted journalists of Palestine, and was interviewed by, I think, an NPR journalist asking me, like, so they're never going to stop sending weapons and money to Israel. Why are you doing this? And we do it because it's the right thing, and not because you're going to win. But sometimes you win anyway. So we have just a couple more speakers left before we get some Ben & Jerry's ice cream. We have another NYC Free Assange member, the polemicist, Jim Kavanaugh.
Hi, thanks for coming. Great to see everybody here. I was a founding member of the New York City Free Assange movement, and I can be found at my Substack. And you can hear me often on the radio with Garland Nixon and Wilma Leon, John Kiriakou. Julian Assange's release was certainly a real ray of hope in what is otherwise a dark and dangerous world now. As someone who helped found New York City Free Assange, who wrote 2 long articles arguing his case, participated in many talk shows about it, and was on the street with Chuck and Bernadette and Marty and in the cold and the heat, I was especially pleased to see this happen. It was a rare and welcome success for progressive activism that we should all celebrate and be proud of. It's okay for us to be a little self-satisfied about this and pat ourselves on the back. Always good to be able to pat yourself on the back. We made a positive difference. It may not have been the only thing or the deciding thing, but it was a positive difference that we made. The millions of people, as people said, around the world who were out there over the years. When we wwere out, I just can't, how, as Chuck and Margaret said, people didn't know what we were talking about. You know, you're out there on this, we have to educate people who didn't even know the name Julian Assange was. And we did make a difference. Recognizing all that, we also have to recognize that the achievement of Julian's freedom is tinged by the unfortunate reality of the plea deal that effected it. I certainly support Julian's accepting that plea because factually and legally, he's only admitting to what he actually did. which was, per the language of the plea, per the language of the plea, this is the charge that he was convicted of, that he was not convicted of, he pled guilty to, there is a difference. What he did was, quote, obtain documents, writings, and notes connected with the national defense and willfully communicate documents relating to the national defense classified at the secret level. That's what he did, and he didn't have a defense against it, a traditional defense. As Stella Assange has said, Julian pled guilty to being a journalist, to doing journalism. Julian had no possibility of avoiding a much harsher sentence. As John Kiriakou has said, because he knows, you could not get a fair trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, and he was not going to wasn't going to be allowed to make a public defense argument, or certainly any kind of jury nullification argument. I also note that the plea agreement stipulated, quote, that Julian, quote, shall take all action within his control, to cause the return to the United States of any such unpublished information in his possession, custody, or control, or that of WikiLeaks or any affiliate of WikiLeaks. So that's an interesting part of the plea agreement that I don't really know that much about. Julian has every right now to enjoy his private life with his family. He's recovering, after all, from the effects, really serious, as people have said, nearly suicide-causing effects of 12 years of involuntary detainment. But I do hope that someday soon we hear directly from him about these concerns, and I don't know if WikiLeaks has something to say about them. But taking a step back, we have to recognize that the US governments, and whatever you want to call it, the deep state censorship complex, got, if not all 175 years they wanted, practically everything they needed from the persecution of Julian Assange. It got Julian's de facto incarceration for 12 years. It got the cooperation of foreign governments in applying American law extraterritorially. And most importantly, it got the precedent of a guilty plea for doing journalism under the Espionage Act, which I think effectively establishes an Official Secrets Act in the United States for the first time. There's no investigative reporter covering America's actions in the world and dealing with classified information who now cannot pause and have second or third thoughts about how far they're willing to go to express the truth. Julian was a harbinger. There is now a more widespread, internationalized as well as Americanized censorship offensive throughout the Euro-American world. And I want first to notice the fact, we should all notice the fact, that the ostensible, principled commitment to free speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression, which was used effectively because those things are poles of attraction to people, which was used effectively to great political effect as a fundamental mark of the superiority of the Western capitalist versus the communist world, has that so-called commitment has, since the demise of Soviet communism, steadily disappeared. And it's now being replaced with aggressive hostility to the principles of free speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression. In other words, the Western world's commitment to free speech was always an instrument, not a principle. And this is astounding to see. I've lived through a long time of it, and to see the reversal is quite stark and incontrovertible. The Assange persecution was not just against Julian personally, it was also against the institution of WikiLeaks, because that was a venue that was free from governmental and traditional media gatekeeping processes, and that provided new trusted channels of protection for whistleblowers and transparency for the public. The Assange persecution was an attack against any such institution. And over the past dozen years, we've seen a new, richly articulated and increasingly aggressive apparatus of censorship and repression that has risen and been built up to put a stop to all of that by attacking and controlling the certainly less committed, but still too dangerously ungated apparatuses of social media and independent publishing. Call it international, transnational, globalist, or whatever you want. I would say the purpose of this censorship apparatus is to reestablish secure gatekeeping of all forms of media whose purpose is to protect the indispensable ideological and political economic hegemony, but the ideological hegemony of US-dominated capitalism, imperialism, and Zionism. Their strategy on this is very clear and very smart. Pick on and amplify various superficially plausible or simply made up nasty characterizations to set people against each other, so that we'll argue about who actually deserves to be censored, harassed, tried, monetized, debanked, or imprisoned. Julian Assange is a smelly cat rapist. Alex Jones is a loudmouth conspiracy theorist. January 6 protesters are insurrectionists. Cop City protesters are domestic terrorists. The Uhuru 3 and Scott Ritter and Danny Shaw and Dan Kovalik and African Stream are foreign agents. Telegram and TikTok are tools of Russia or China. Pro-Palestinian student protesters are anti-Semites. This is where we're at now, and it's going to get worse. It will be a mistake for leftists not to resist when this happens to people we don't like. It's going to get worse for anyone who dissents from the establishment narrative of Putin's perfidy against Ukraine, or the perfection of the American electoral system, or China's aggression against its own province of Taiwan, etc. As far as the establishment is concerned, we are in a state of war against Russia in one theater and against Iran and the Palestinian people in another, and soon against China. And for them, that necessitates wartime censorship. In this context, I like to say that American and European polities have been reconfigured into what the French theorist Etienne Balibar called the state of preemptive counter-revolution. Unfortunately, there is no revolutionary movement, but there is a pre-revolutionary socioeconomic and geopolitical and ideological crisis. So the European and American states are reconstituting themselves as counter-revolutionary regimes, establishing fascistic counter-revolutionary policies and stoking diversionary cultural and identitarian conflicts to defeat a revolutionary opposition by preventing its emergence, ironically, in the name of anti-fascism. So I'll say again, this is going to get worse, most immediately and especially regarding the sanctity of Zionism and Israel and the diabolical perniciousness of Iran and the Palestinian resistance. It's going to get worse precisely because of the surprisingly quick and thorough way in which the Zionist narrative has been undermined, and indeed, as I argued in a recent essay, a real and unprecedented anti-Zionist discourse has taken hold in this country in the past 11 months. The entire spectrum of the ruling class in the US and Europe will do anything to stop that. Kamala says free speech is a privilege. Hillary says misinformation should be criminalized. Trump says we have to close the internet in some ways. Despite some silly hopium, there's no free speech warrior in this election. All the people across the duopoly are motivated to aggressively censor anti-Zionism. They are going to pressure universities to crack down on anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. On pro-Palestinian students will be at risk of losing their education. Anti-Zionists will be banished from social media. States and federal government will forbid payments to anyone who protests Israel or refuses to accept the legitimacy of the Zionist project. The French example, which we have now, of refusing to accept the result of an election that hints of any faction with less than complete support for Israel and Zionism coming into the government will spread. The Digital Services Act in Europe and all the disinformation governance nonsense and the spate of legislation adopting the IHR definition of anti-Semitism and using it to defund and ultimately criminalize all anti-Zionist activity will spread. These initiatives are part of a unified global campaign of preemptive counter-revolutionary censorship and repression. So in short, what I want to say is Julian Assange is free, but speech isn't. The press isn't. Expression isn't. It's under more threat than it has been for a century in this country. And the internationalized extraterritorial application of American law that we saw in the Assange case has now become an internationalized censorship regime that is subsuming what was the unique protection of the First Amendment in this country. Richard Medhurst, Sarah Wilkinson, C.J. Hopkins, Ali Abunimah are the international co-defendants of Scott Ritter, Chairman O'Malley, Danny Shaw, Dan Kovalik, and Julian Assange. So we can take a measure of self-satisfaction in what we achieved in helping to free Julian Assange, and we should. But I'm afraid In the words of that great American drummer, we've only just begun.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I am happy to announce the other co-host of Useful Idiots, Katie Halper.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I really didn't think that we would have something like this because I assumed that Julian Assange would actually die behind bars. I was so thrilled and incredulous when I was told that he had been released. I was also afraid because he's so incredibly principled and steadfast that he wouldn't accept anything that would require him to, make a plea. So I was really happy about that. Also, I think that, we should be very relieved and happy and look at all the reasons that this happened, but we also, as I'm sure everyone here is, remain vigilant and be aware of what we were able to achieve, but also what the obstacles were. So whatever we did achieve, we achieved despite the corporate media here, not because of the corporate media, obviously, despite MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, all these entities that should have, of course, been clamoring for Julian's freedom and weren't. So when we look back at this, we have to be very clear-eyed about the fact that this was not because the free press, the Western free press, came to the rescue of Assange, because they obviously didn't. This all happened despite their silence and complicity. I also think that it was a really revealing moment or experience, because it wasn't just a moment, but it really showed how easy it is for people to be manipulated and brainwashed through emotion. I'm not saying anything that revolutionary or original here, but it is shocking that people who I otherwise thought of as smart, reasonable, well-read people were able to be swept into this smear campaign. And, all these people, I guess there's like Trump derangement syndrome, but there's also Hillary Clinton derangement syndrome. And so all these, which is anyone who supports her in the first place, but that's another thing. This is even worse. But, all these people who, just because they thought that he gave the election to Hillary Clinton, they didn't really care about any evidence or any legal issues. And these are the same people, I thought it was so ironic, these are the same people who loved Obama and said he was this, steward of international law and the rule of law and democracy and freedom. And yet when Joe Biden basically sided with Trump, went in the Trumpian direction, not that Obama was a freedom fighter for Assange, but when he went in the Trumpian direction, none of these people who loved Obama for being a constitutional law professor minded. So it was really revealing and clarifying, and you really saw who were critical thinkers and who were not critical thinkers. I think that we have to remember that people who weren't convinced, it's kind of a project for us, I think, to work on those people, although some, of course, are lost causes. But I do think it's worth remembering that, as other speakers here have said, it's the fight for Julian is over, but the fight for a free press, free speech, a fight against McCarthyism, the fight against groupthink, and Cold Warriorism and Cold War 2.0ism is far from over. I don't really think I have that much else to say, except that I'm really happy that we are here. Didn't think it would be this way. So happy for Julian and Stella and his 2 children. And I recommend that everyone give people the book, The Trial of Julian Assange by Niels Melzer, because it's very eye-opening. And what's so fascinating about that book is that this is a guy who's obviously knows what he's talking about. He's a special rapporteur, UN special rapporteur on torture. Also, fascinatingly enough, was someone who totally drank the Kool-Aid and had to, despite that, realize that Julian Assange was worth defending. So if he could realize that, I think other people can. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and for having me.
Thank you so much, Katie. That book by Niels Melzer is actually here at the People's Forum's little library out in front, so you can check that out. So Just one speaker left before we get some Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Somebody I want to shout out for just being an incredible stalwart of this movement, helping me every day, and Julian, I don't think, would be free without him. Our National Organizing Director, Vinny DiStefano.
Nathan, you were too kind. You've all had the best, now you get the rest. And soon ice cream. Okay, let's see if we get the mic right. Clavo mi remo en el agua. Llevo tu remo en el mío. Creo que he visto un luz al otro lado del río. These are the opening lyrics of the song by Jorge Drexler in the Motorcycle Diaries about the great revolutionary hero, Che Guevara. During the 7 years that I've been involved with the Assange Defense, this lyric has come to my mind often because it's a beautiful song of hope, seeing the light on the other side of the river. On the West Coast, we put our first Assange Forum at the UCLA School of Law together in February 2019. Some of the people in this room assisted or spoke at that event. That day, I was filled with confidence. Confidence that even if it took a long time, I could see the light on the other side of the river, and that light was Julian Assange's freedom, and journalism would be protected. Together, from across the country and around the world, we collectively put our oars in the water and pulled it together. By the way, those lyrics, I put my oar in the water, I pull your oar in mine, I believe I see a light on the other side of the river, were what I was thinking of. Unfortunately, as the days, the months, and the years pass, that light began to dim, especially after Julian was illegally, immorally dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy and incarcerated in Belmarsh Prison, England's answer to our own Guantanamo Bay. For me, unfortunately, the light appeared to have been extinguished after the last hearing in London. I was there to speak along with many others, and we'd expected that Julian might appear. However, in the end, he was simply too ill to leave his cell or even watch the proceedings on a video link. It was at that moment that I began to think that Julian would not die in the United States. He would die in Belmarsh Prison, and possibly the light would be gone forever. On that rainy day, I sat in a tent next to Stella, both of us waiting to address the more than 1,000 people assembled, the very people that Vanessa Barrister said to the defense, can you please get them to be quiet because we can't hear what's happening in the court. And I thought to myself, God damn it, that's the voice of the people talking to you. However, I looked at Stella, and at that moment, I thought that if I was to disturb her in any way, she might shatter from her grief. However, when she got up to speak, her incredible strength and unbelievable courage emanated from her as a brilliant light. Her words were not of defeat, but of defiance. It was a remarkable thing to witness, and I shall remember it to the end of my days. Then, on June 5th, I was on a call with the GON Network. This is the Global Amnesty Action Network. I've been an Amnesty member for over 40 years, to secure prisoner of conscience status for Julian, something shamefully that Amnesty International to this date has refused to give him. We were talking, and all of a sudden, someone on the call said, Julian's reached a deal. He could be free today. I spent the entire night watching as things began to unfold. Early the next morning, Julian was on a plane to freedom. The light had finally reemerged and burned as bright as the sun that greeted Julian when he arrived in Australia. Comrades, let us all recognize this victory, for it was a victory of activism. Although, as Joe correctly said, they knew they were going to lose. The reason they knew they were going to lose was our voices were too strong to allow the corrupt British system to operate as it had. It's important that this victory was made possible by the people. We beat the corrupt British judicial system, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, and most importantly, the murderously cruel and immoral imperial might of the United States of America. We must recognize this monumental achievement made by people from around the world pulling their oars together. Therefore, we come today to celebrate, and it is a good thing that we do that. At the same time, we come together to use this victory to steel ourselves for the fights that remain. We must abolish the 1917 Espionage Act now. We must secure Julian a full and complete pardon. We must continue to struggle to protect journalists and journalism, for they are still in grave danger. Look at the faces on the wall. With two exceptions, every one of them murdered for the crime of journalism. The other two imprisoned for the same crime. I ask you to please look at those people. We must continue our work because they need us to continue that work. We must all put our oars in the water and pull towards the light of freedom and justice. Thank you very much. And now it's time for ice cream. I would like to say one thing. Nathan was too kind. There were lots and lots of people that worked on this. They are here in this room that I worked with, that I consider my friends and comrades. But Nathan, it's been an honor, privilege to work with you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're still at AssangeDefense.org and CourageFound.org. We're going to continue this fight and pick up a few others. So thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
See if I... Before we eat the ice cream, can I add something?